Hello, mathematicians! Today we're going to be learning about subtraction using decimals. To get us started, we're first going to do an example that does not require borrowing, otherwise known as regrouping. So here we have 45 and 94 hundredths minus 3 1/10. What we're going to do to make it a little easier is we're going to add a place value chart. So here notice that when we put our numbers in our place value chart, our decimal points get lined up. So a trick, if we didn't have this chart, is to line up our decimal points when we subtract so that our place values are lined up. If you notice here in our hundredths place value, we only have one number, and that's because 3 1/10 does not have a number in the hundredths place value. So to make it easier for us to subtract, we could add a 0 there. And just like subtracting whole numbers, in order to subtract decimals, we're going to start with the lowest place value, which in this case is the hundredths place value. So we're going to subtract normally. 4 minus 0 is equal to 4. Then we're going to move on to the tenths place value, and here we have 9 minus 1, which is equal to 8. If we didn't have this chart, make sure you bring down your decimal point for your answer, because if you don't, that would change the value. That is very, very important, so please don't forget that. Then we're going to move on to our ones place, and there we have 5 minus 3, which is equal to 2. Finally, in our tenths place, we have 4 minus nothing, which is just equal to 4. So 45 and 94 hundredths minus 3 1/10 is equal to 42 and 84 hundredths. Now let's move on to another example, and this time we will borrow, otherwise known as regroup. So here we have 92 and 48 thousandths minus 51 and 92 hundredths. So we add our numbers to our place value chart, where our place values then get lined up. Notice again that our decimal points get lined up when we line up our place values. So if we were subtracting without this chart, make sure you line up your decimal points, and that will ensure that your place values are lined up. Now, if we take a look at our hundredths place value, notice that we only have one number here, so we can add a 0 as a place value holder. And so now we could start subtracting. So we have 8 minus 0, and that's equivalent to 8. Then moving on to our hundredths place value, we have 4 minus 2, which is equal to 2. Then we have 0 minus 9. We cannot take 9 away from 0, so we're going to have to borrow from the 2 in the ones place. And so that 2 in the ones place will then become a 1, and the 0 in the tenths place will then become a 10. So now we have 10 minus 9, which we can do, and that is equivalent to 1. Remember that if we didn't have this chart, you would need to bring down your decimal point and then move on to the ones place value, which now we have 1 minus 1, and that is equal to 0. And then finally move to the tenths place value, and here we have 9 minus 5, which is equal to 4. So 92 and 48 thousandths minus 51 and 92 hundredths is equivalent to 40 and 128 thousandths. All right, let's do a few more examples. So here we have 1 and 73 hundredths minus 3 tenths. So we could say 0 and 3 tenths or just 3 tenths, but because it's just 0, we don't have to say that. So make sure you line up the decimals, and then we are going to subtract. Notice that there's an empty spot there, so to make it easier, we can add a 0 so that we could subtract. So now we have 3 minus 0, and that is equal to 3. Then we move on to 7 minus 3, and that is equal to 4. Make sure you bring down the decimal point. Then we have 1 minus 0, which is equal to 1. And so 1 and 73 hundredths minus 3 tenths is equivalent to 1 and 43 hundredths. So let's do another example. we have 1 and 24 hundredths minus 9 tenths. Line up our decimals. So we're going to line them up using our decimal points. And then notice we have an empty space, so we could just add a 0 there. And then we just subtract normally. So 4 minus 0 is equivalent to 4. 2 minus 9, we can't do that, so we have to borrow from the 1. And then when we borrow from the 1 becomes a 0, and the 2 becomes a 12. So now we have 12 minus 9, which we can do, and that is equal to 3. And then we're going to move on, and 0 minus 0 is just 0. So 1 and 24 hundredths minus 9 tenths is equivalent to 34 hundredths. So let's do 2 more examples. So here we have 9 and 73 hundredths minus 4. Now 4 is a whole number, so the decimal point in 4 would be after the 4. And so we line up 9 and 73 hundredths with 4 by lining up the ones place, so the 9 and the 4. We add a decimal after the 4, and we could add zeros there as placeholders to make it easier to subtract. So 3 minus 0 is equal to 3. 7 minus 0 is equal to 7. Make sure you bring down your decimal point or value will be totally different. And then 9 minus 4 is equal to 5. So 9 and 73 hundredths minus 4 is equal to 5 and 73 hundredths. Let's do our final example now. We have 82 minus 4 and 3 tenths. Notice here that 82 is a whole number, so the decimal point in 82 would be after the 2. So this is how we line it up, and we add our decimal to make it easier so when we look at it, we could see how our decimal points are lined up. And notice that there's an empty space, so we just add a 0 there. So now we just subtract normally. We're going to start off with 0 minus 3, but because we can't do that, we have to cross out the 2, make that a 1, so that the 0 could become a 10. So 10 minus 3 is equal to 7. Then bring down our decimal point, and we're going to subtract 1 minus 4. Now, we can't take 4 away from 1, so we're going to have to borrow again. This time we're going to borrow from the 8. The 8 will then become a 7, and so that 1 here will then become an 11. So 11 minus 4 is equal to 7. And then finally, 7 minus nothing is equal to 7. So 82 minus 4 and 3 tenths is equivalent to 77 and 7 tenths. And that's it for subtracting with decimals.